In any case, were I to invoke logic, logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
I am a logical man, Doctor.
Well, it'll take more than logic to get us out of this.
Logic is a little tweeting bird chirping in a meadow. Logic is a wreath of pretty flowers which smell bad.
The ears make all of the difference.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
One does not thank logic, Amanda.
Logic. I'm sick to death of logic.
But it is very logical.
There's that magic word again. Does your logic find this fascinating, Mr. Spock?
Our logic is to be illogical. That is our advantage. Mr. Spock, it is time. The explosive.
Very well, Captain.
Logic suggests...
Logic? My God, the man's talking about logic. We're talking about universal Armageddon.
Commence primary ignition.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to episode 5 of the Logic Blaster podcast. Today we're going to be talking about two of the Disney Plus Star Wars shows, Andor and Tales of the Jedi. And before we get into that, I want to just give a big thank you to all of you for your patience. I had planned to do this episode weeks ago, and due to some technical difficulties and certain circumstances, I just couldn't get it done. But it's done now, and you're watching it. So once again, thank you very much for waiting. It's been a month since I did the last episode of the podcast, so I very much appreciate your patience and you're sticking with me. I also want to mention that I'm now over 800 subscribers. I did a little screenshot of when I hit the 800 mark. Thank you again for all of you new people who've signed on as subscribers. I very much appreciate the fact that you're willing to listen to my voice and listen to my opinions about action figures and various other things. Welcome if you're brand new, and I very much appreciate the fact that you're here and that you're checking out my podcast. So let's get into the topic. I want to give a spoiler warning because I will be talking about plot details for both of these shows. So if you haven't watched these shows and you don't want to be spoiled, I would turn away now, just because I will be talking in depth about what happens in these shows, and I'll be doing a little bit of speculating in terms of the future for these shows as well, because I'm guessing, we know that Andor is going to have a second season, and I think it's very likely, based on the reception of Tales of the Jedi, that we probably will get more of that as well. If Lucasfilm is smart, they will do more of Tales of the Jedi. So, in terms of these two shows, I think it's interesting to talk about them together because they really represent two different visions for Star Wars. Andor is a sort of slow-paced, sort of long-winded show, which is the vision mostly, I believe, of Tony Gilroy and the various directors who are working on that show. It ran for 12 episodes, and there's been a lot of criticism from certain Star Wars fans that it doesn't really feel like Star Wars because of how long-winded it is. And I think that's a fair critique. And I'm going to go through my thoughts on that in particular as we get into it. Also, Tales of the Jedi is sort of completely the opposite. It's very concise, it's very focused, it's very brief, and it leaves you wanting more. It's the sign of very good storytelling. And that series is obviously created by Dave Filoni and the team that worked on Clone Wars, Rebels, and those various other animated shows. The show is animated, if you didn't know, it really represents a completely different, vision for Star Wars. And to me, Tales of the Jedi, we'll get into it a little bit later in the show. I'm going to talk about Andor first. But in terms of it feeling more like Star Wars, it really does. And we'll talk about that after we finish discussing Andor. So in terms of Andor, like I mentioned, it ran for 12 episodes, but to my mind, there's really only 5.5 of them that actually matter. And that's a little frustrating when you're watching the show, because there does seem to be a lot of filler and a lot of stuff that seems really quite boring in the context of the show. And it's a shame, because the overall story I really enjoyed, and I really like the idea of living for a longer period of time in the world of Star Wars. But as you're watching it, you kind of feel like, is this really Star Wars? It doesn't feel like the fast-paced nature of the way George Lucas told the story of Star Wars. So as you're watching it, you're sort of like, what is this? And there's also, I believe there's no mention of the Force whatsoever. There's no Jedi, which it kind of makes sense that there's no Jedi, but at the same time, this is in line with Rogue One, where the Force is obviously mentioned. It's obviously present. The Guardians of the Wills, who guard the temple on Jeddah, are very much in tune with the Force, and so it's ever present in that movie, even though there are no Jedi in the film. So that's one thing that seems glaringly missing from this particular series. Maybe that'll change as we get into season 2, but I did notice right away that it does seem very far removed from, the Force, which is ever present in virtually every incarnation of Star Wars that I've ever seen. So that's sort of a kind of a frustrating aspect of this show. So I'm going to get into the particular episodes that are important to the series, and if you are short on time and you don't really feel like watching all 12 episodes, I'm going to break it down for you in terms of the ones that I feel are the most important, and the ones that really, stand the test of time in terms of actually telling this particular story. And I think these will be the most important going forward as we head into season 2 of this show. So the first episode that I would say is significant in this show is episode 3, which is called Reckoning. This is the particular episode where we see Cassian meet with Luthen for the first time. There's also flashbacks in the episode which shows how Cassian was rescued when he was a young man, taken away from the planet where he lived, and he was taken in, by Marva as, sort of a surrogate mother. His people were sort of in a lot of trouble because they had sort of come upon the wreckage of a Republic cruiser, which had, I believe, been knocked out in the Clone Wars or something like that. They don't really go into the details of what happened, but basically that ship had crashed on the planet where Cassian lived with his people, and he had gotten on board the ship, and actually that's where Marv actually finds him. So it's an interesting backstory for Cassian, and I like that aspect of this particular episode. And really the meetup between Cassian and Luthen is very significant, because it is Cassian's sort of first entry into the world of Luthen, and it sets up what's going to happen in the rest of the series. So it's pretty important. The next episode you can kind of skip ahead to is episode 6, which is called The Eye. So this episode shows the heist on Aldhani, which is a successful rebel attack on an Imperial base. And what happens is Cassian teams up with a group of rebels that Luthen has sort of recruited together, led by Vel. And their mission is to infiltrate the base and steal a payroll for an entire sector. So pretty significant hit, and they are successful, although not completely successful, because most of the team, other than Cassian and Vel, basically die in the process. Cassian actually ends up killing one of them, who was going to betray Vel at the very end. So kind of cold-blooded, but at the same time, that guy Skeen was a pretty shady character, and he was he wanted to take the entire plunder from the heist for himself. Basically, he wanted to split it with Cassian and make their escape and leave, Vel in the dust, which Cassian was not down with. He didn't really understand the motives of Skeen. Well, I guess he understood that it was a selfish move, and he wasn't having it. So he just shoots him, and then he takes his cut and parts ways with Vel, which it doesn't sit well with Vel. She obviously sees it as a betrayal because she doesn't believe that Skeen would betray them like that. But it is the truth, and sometimes the truth is a tough pill to swallow. The next important episode I want to mention is episode 8, Narkina 5. And this one's important because it kind of connects the dots with a bunch of different characters, including Mon Mothma, Bix, which is one of Cassian's friends back on Ferrix, and also Vel. You also see the first meeting between Luthen and Saw Gerrera. Saw Gerrera we obviously know from Rogue One and also Clone Wars and Rebels. So he's a significant Rebel character, and I think it's really fantastic that he's included in this show. Obviously played by Forrest Whitaker, who is a fantastic actor, and I think he nails every scene that he's in as that character. So it's great. There's only 2 scenes with Saw Gerrera in the season, which is frustrating. I'm hoping there'll be more in season 2, but that first meeting between Luthen and Saw is actually pretty telling, because Luthen is trying to recruit Saw Gerrera for a particular mission, and Saw really doesn't want to do it. He doesn't seem to trust anyone, and he sort of thinks of his own mission as a rebel as being more significant than anyone else's efforts, and it's a little arrogant, but he has his own way of doing things, and he doesn't really want to listen to anybody else. The next episode I want to talk about is probably the most action-packed of all of them. Certainly the most tense and really entertaining, which is episode 10. So this is the prison break episode. Obviously, in Narkina 5, we see Cassian taken to this Imperial facility where it's like a labor camp. The prisoners rise up and they break out, and it includes this really incredible performance by Andy Serkis, and I would watch it just for that. Like, even if you don't watch any of the rest of the series, that particular episode, the performance by Andy Serkis is spectacular. He really nails that character, and I respect that guy as an actor, and he obviously played Gollum in Lord of the Rings, and the guy has immense talent, and that episode is really just incredible. There's also some important scenes with Mon Mothma, and there's also a scene, there's like a speech that Luthen gives to this spy that he has in the ISB. There's sort of this meeting between those two, and Luthen gives a really significant speech that is very good in terms of developing his character. It explains a lot of his motives, and all of that is in this one episode, episode 10. So it's actually really quite good in terms of actually packing in a lot of useful information into a single episode. So the next episode I want to mention is episode 11, Daughter of Ferrix, and I can really only recommend the second half of this episode. It's an incredibly slow-moving episode for the most part, and it basically talks about the death of Cassian's adopted mother, Marva. And the first half it's just very slow-moving, but the second half has some really important parts in it, so I do recommend watching the second half of the episode. It includes the second meeting between Luthen and Saw Gerrera, which I think is very significant. In that meeting, essentially, Luthen is there to kind of warn Saw off from getting involved with a mission by a certain sect of rebels, which is kind of doomed. They've sort of been set up to get, captured by the ISB. So Luthen is there to sort of say to Saw, yeah, this is not happening. And Saw, that doesn't really sit too well with Saw Gerrera. Like, he doesn't like that at all. After that meeting, we do see a significant scene with Luthen's ship, the Fondor, which we all assume is powered by kyber crystals. We don't really know too much about Luthen's backstory, but that ship has been nicknamed the Lightsaber ship because it basically seems to have some connection with kyber crystals, and certainly there are weapons on it that sort of shoot out of the sides of it that look very much like lightsabers. So, very interesting ship, certainly very capable, and he sort of eludes this Imperial ship, completely disables their tractor beam. And it's an impressive scene. It's very brief, but it is one of the few kind of space battle scenes, which includes TIE fighters and stuff. And it's an exciting scene, and I'm hoping we'll see more of that ship in the second season. And at the end of the episode, Cassian gets informed of his mother's death, and we also see the parting of Cassian and Melshi. Melshi is one of the other prisoners who escapes from Narkina 5, and Melshi is obviously a character that we meet in Rogue One. He obviously joins up with the Rebels, and he's part of the mission at the very end of the film with Cassian and crew. So obviously it was cool to actually see the introduction of Melshi, and actually, the scene between him and Cassian at the end where they kind of part ways. You can tell that they form sort of a brotherhood, a mutual understanding of, how to fight the Empire, and it's pretty cool. I like that scene a lot. Again, the episode, I can't recommend it, the total episode, but the second half of it is actually very good. And then the final episode, episode 12, which is called Rick's Road, shows the uprising on Ferrix. Cassian obviously returns to Ferrix, and he's able to rescue his friends, and he has a sort of uncomfortable reunion with Luthen, because Luthen, basically had come there to kill Cassian, because Cassian's one of the loose ends that he left open that could expose his identity. And at the end, Cassian sort of kind of surrenders to him and says, you can either kill me or you can take me in. And that's where the show ends. And I think it's kind of a fitting ending, and it's a very nice setup for, what's going to happen in the second season. From what I understand, the way the showrunners have described the show, it is essentially going to lead directly into the events of Rogue One. So that's it's going to be pretty interesting what they end up doing with second season. I'm hoping that they'll be more concise in terms of the storytelling in second season, that they won't drag it out and have a lot of filler episodes. I'm hoping it's more on target in terms of actually telling the important parts of the story. Maybe they'll do fewer episodes second season, or maybe the episodes will just have more information packed in. We'll see. So what I'm hoping for in second season, I'm hoping for more of Saw Gerrera. I would actually like to see how he sustains his injuries. The way we meet him in Rogue One, he's sort of, he has like robotic legs. He has to have this breathing thing on his face. And he's a mess, in Rogue One. So he obviously went through something to get in that condition, because he's obviously not that way when we see him in this series. So I'd like to see, what happened to Saw Gerrera. I'd also like to have a little bit more of Luthen's backstory. He's pretty much a mystery at this point. Obviously has some connection to kyber crystals. Does he have some connection to the Jedi? We don't really know at this point, so I'll be interested to see what they end up doing with that. I'd also like to see more of the Rebels. How does Bail Organa, fit into the equation? We didn't see any of him in this particular series, this first season. So it would be nice if we get some of him in the second season. I wouldn't mind seeing the backstory with Bodhi Rook, who's the Imperial pilot that we meet in Rogue One. He obviously was given, he had met with Galen Erso and was given instructions to, meet up with Saw Gerrera. So they could actually include something of Galen and Bodhi, like how they met and how Bodhi had decided to, turn on the Empire and actually, become a rebel. So I think that would be a great story to tell, and I'm hoping maybe they'll do some of that stuff. The showrunners had again mentioned that this is supposed to directly connect with the events of Rogue One, so I would love it if they actually showed Galen Erso and maybe some of the other characters, like Director Krennic. They could include him at some point, maybe even Tarkin. We'll see what happens. I have, pretty good expectations for the second season, but again, they really need to, hone in on, telling a much more concise story. I just think they alienated a lot of Star Wars fans by dragging it out too much. Overall, I like the show, but I think it leaves some wanting in terms of the way this particular story is told. Okay, so moving on. Next, we're going to talk about Tales of the Jedi. And I'm super excited to talk to you about this show. I think it's just one of the most spectacular things I've seen, one of the most exciting things I've seen in the world of Star Wars for quite some time. And it essentially follows two storylines, one with Count Dooku and the other with Ahsoka Tano. So beginning with Dooku, there's 6 episodes altogether. So the 3 of them that cover Count Dooku are episodes 2, 3, and 4. Episode 2 has a young Count Dooku and a young Qui-Gon Jinn, which I found fascinating to actually see. I would watch a whole show about those two. I think it's pretty interesting. But the particular episode, it shines a light on Count Dooku's motives, his views on corruption, and also the overall effectiveness of the Jedi to actually be negotiators and diplomats. You can see him sort of questioning things, and also his relationship with Qui-Gon. You can tell Qui-Gon very much wants to do the right thing, but also you can kind of see the influence of Dooku on Qui-Gon as well, because as we know from when we meet Qui-Gon in episode 1, he has a certain defiance against the Jedi Council, and I believe a lot of that he may have picked up from his master, Count Dooku. So pretty interesting to see those two together. Episode 3 actually has a sort of mission with Count Dooku and Mace Windu, where they investigate the death of a Jedi Knight. And interesting, so you see, Mace Windu kind of following the book, doing things by the book, and then Count Dooku kind of like pushing against that, trying to, do the right thing, but, sort of breaking all the rules in the process. And at the end of the episode, Mace Windu gets a seat on the Jedi Council, and you can tell that doesn't really sit well with Count Dooku. He kind of, you can tell he sort of resents the fact that, Mace, by playing it safe, he's cool with the council, and because Dooku doesn't play it safe, he's sort of shunned by the council. So it's I think it's sort of that dogmatic thinking of the Jedi that sort of Count Dooku is pushing back against. And then episode 4 is amazing because it actually overlaps the events of episode 1. You get to see Count Dooku. He actually goes into the library and erases the files on Kamino. So you can tell he's already working with Palpatine at that point. And you also see a scene with Qui-Gon before he has the encounter with, where he dies at the hands of Darth Maul. And then you see a scene with Dooku after the death of Qui-Gon where he's mourning the death of his apprentice, and pretty interesting stuff and very moving in terms of the performances. I say performances. I mean, this is animated, but at the same time, you have actors doing the voices, so there is a performance involved there, and it's pretty interesting. And in the process of this, Yaddle discovers Dooku's secret and follows him to sort of the lair on Coruscant, where he meets up with Palpatine. There's a big lightsaber duel, and obviously Yaddle dies. Again, just really well-told story, and it's certainly a more fitting death, I think, for Yaddle than the way her death was actually treated in the comic books. So, I mean, they both are significant, but I think this one, because it's so targeted in terms of her discovering the truth and then suffering the consequences, the ultimate consequence, losing her life. And it explains why she's not around later on in the story, too. So, really cool stuff with Count Dooku. I really like that a lot. And then in terms of Ahsoka, there are 3 episodes about her: Episode 1, Episode 5, and Episode 6. In the first episode, you basically see Ahsoka's origin on her planet, where she's born, and you see her, show her powers early on, and they identify her as a Jedi because of those abilities. And I think it's really kind of amazing to see that she had those kinds of talents early on. So pretty cool. And then episode 5 is really poetic because it's called Practice Makes Perfect, and it's all about Anakin Skywalker teaching Ahsoka how to defend herself under the most extreme circumstances. So he decides to make a test where he pits her own clones against her, and unwittingly he essentially trains her to survive Order 66. And that's what makes it so poetic, because we now understand like what happens in the final season of Clone Wars, why she's able to defend herself against the clones turning on her, is because of all that training that she got. And so I found that just incredibly cool, an amazing episode. And then episode 6, we see Ahsoka in hiding after Order 66. She's ultimately discovered, and she has to face off against an Inquisitor, which she makes very quick work of, but still a very cool design for that Inquisitor, and I really loved that whole scene, the whole sequence. And at the very end, she meets up with Bail Organa. Obviously, she's decided to sort of not hide anymore and actually join up with the rebels and try and make a purpose for herself again. So really amazing storytelling in terms of the way this entire series was executed. There's nothing about it I don't like. I recommend watching all 6 episodes, and they are very short, and it does leave you wanting more, which I think that is the sign of good storytelling. It is the sign of what most people like about Star Wars. It's quick-paced, it's to the point, and it doesn't waste time on frivolous stuff. It really gets down to the storytelling, and I think because Dave Filoni really understands Star Wars, you can sort of expect that kind of thing when you watch this kind of series. So I highly recommend it. If you haven't watched Tales of the Jedi, you definitely should. It's an amazing series. So in terms of what's next for Tales of the Jedi, I'm hoping they'll do at least another season, and I wouldn't mind it if they did a season where it was Tales of the Sith instead of Tales of the Jedi, because I think you could actually do something interesting with maybe showing a young Palpatine, or maybe do 3 episodes about young Palpatine, his master, and then maybe do 3 episodes where it was Palpatine and Maul, like part of Maul's training. I think that would be fascinating, or maybe even like show how Palpatine recruited Dooku. There's so much that could be done in terms of exploring the background of the Sith, and they could even go further back towards the earlier stuff. Although I think they're going to cover that in the Acolyte series. I believe that's set something like 100 years before Episode 1. So I believe they're going to cover some of the Sith Masters and Apprentices that existed prior to when Palpatine comes on the scene. So that seems like a pretty interesting show. I'm hoping they can pull it off and actually make it interesting. I'm a little fearful that they'll just go off on some tangents that aren't particularly interesting, but at least it will involve the Force and Force users, and also show it from the dark side perspective, which I think a lot of that hasn't really been covered too much. So I think that could be quite interesting. So that's pretty much going to cover it for these two series for me. I enjoyed both of them. Obviously, Tales of the Jedi seems a lot more like Star Wars to me by comparison to Andor. I do like the time period of Andor, how it leads into the rebellion and certainly the events of Rogue One. I do want to see more of that, and I'm looking forward to season 2. But in terms of the overall execution of it, I think it could have been way better. It could have been way shorter, for one thing. It didn't need to be 12 episodes, for sure. Could have easily been 6. Like I mentioned, I was able to break it down into just 5.5 that have pretty much all the information that you really need to have in order to understand the story. So that says a lot. If you can tell a story in 5.5 episodes instead of 12, I think it's better to do it that way. And I think my thoughts are echoed by a number of other Star Wars fans who were bored by the series, who just didn't really feel like it felt very Star Warsy. So hopefully Lucasfilm is listening to the fans, and that they will, as they head into season 2, which I'm not sure if it's filming or it's already filmed, but I know they're working on it, and hopefully they will listen to the feedback and actually make second season significantly better and hopefully shorter than the first season. So in terms of the podcast, what's coming up next? So I do want to do an episode on G.I. Joe. I'd like to do a bunch of episodes on G.I. Joe. The one I am tentatively planning to do is pertains to my 40th anniversary Marines collection. So much like I did with the first episode, I'd like to show you the full collection that I have of all the Marines that I have. I have quite a few, and I think it would make for an interesting sort of showcase in terms of just going through each of those and how I've sort of assembled them using bits from the 40th anniversary, but also Timeless collection and various other pieces to create my collection of Marines. So that's one episode I want to do down the road. I actually wanted to do it in December, but I ran out of time. It's tough to get these podcasts together and do the planning and everything. And like I had mentioned in the short video that I put out, I started a second job, so I've actually been very busy working, and I just haven't had as much opportunity to actually put these kinds of things together. But I am determined to get it done in the new year, and hopefully we'll have some cool episodes of the podcast coming up. Also, The Bad Batch Season 2 premieres in January, and I had covered the first half of The Bad Batch. I did breakdowns of the first 8 episodes on my channel, but I sort of stopped just because hardly anyone was watching those videos. They were getting like 6 views or something like that. And so it took a lot of effort to put those together, and hardly anyone was watching them. So I was like, what am I doing? I'm wasting my time because no one's watching this. I found it fun to actually examine the series, but if no one is interested in it, it didn't make sense. But I would like to do sort of a final review of first season, and maybe I'll pair that up with a review of, because I think they're releasing the first 2 episodes like that first week in January. So hopefully I'll do an episode of the podcast about the Bad Batch, and we'll recap the first season and also get into a little bit of second season and sort of talk about it. Part of the reason why I like this podcast format is it doesn't have to be about one particular thing. It's a little more flexible than some of the videos that I actually do, so it gives me the chance to sort of talk about TV series and movies and all kinds of different things. So anyway, I'm glad you tuned in for this particular episode of the podcast, and please stay tuned for future episodes. I'm probably not going to be able to, do them as often as I would like, but I'm going to try and do at least one per month, and we'll see what happens. I need to do a better job in terms of planning out my time, trying to juggle 2 jobs and also create content for YouTube is turning out to be more of a challenge than I expected. So, but I'm very glad that you guys are tuning in and that you're enjoying the content. So feel free to leave comments below. If you have thoughts about Andor and Tales of the Jedi, make sure to leave them in the comment section below. And that's pretty much it for this episode. Thank you again for tuning in. Thank you for the new subscribers. And I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.